She'd been silent her whole life, but when her adopted daughter hit her with a glass in front of the whole family, what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The creak of the floorboards beneath my feet has become a familiar rhythm, a kind of music only the house and I know. At this hour, just after dawn, the light filters through the kitchen curtains in a soft golden haze. I shuffle to the stove, wrapping my cardigan tighter around my shoulders, and set the kettle to boil. The silence in my home isn't empty, it's full of memories. I like it that way. Outside, the magnolia tree stretches skyward, its thick arms gnarled with age, just like mine. It's been here longer than I have. Its roots tangled beneath the soil, deep and wide, holding this land the way I've held this life. The house itself is modest. White clapboard siding, faded green shutters, a wraparound porch with wicker chairs that creak in sympathy when you sit too long. It's not much by the world's standards, but it's mine. Every nail, every beam, every repaired pipe and coat of paint carries the weight of my labor, my sacrifice, my history. I am Margaret James, 74 years old, widowed, a mother by choice, not blood, and this house is the only thing I've ever truly owned. It's easy for people to forget what it meant to own something when you were born with nothing. When you were told, in word and in deed, that nothing would ever be yours. I was born in 1949 in a 2-room shotgun house on the edge of Tallahassee, Florida. The color of my skin wrote the first chapter of my life before I had a chance to pick up a pen. My mother cleaned houses. My father paved roads. Neither of them made it past the 6th grade, but they taught me the value of 2 things: dignity and work. Dignity is what you hold on to when nothing else is yours. Work is what you do to survive. At 16, I started working for the Whitfords, a wealthy white family who lived in a columned house with a chandelier in every room and a kitchen bigger than our entire home. I was paid $3 a week to scrub their floors, press their linens, and smile while their teenage daughters called me Margaret when they were feeling kind, and girl when they weren't. The Whitfords weren't cruel people by the standards of the time. They didn't beat me, didn't call me names to my face, but their kindness always had sharp edges. They bought me a used coat once, too small for my shoulders, and told me it was from the Lord's blessing. When I thanked them, I felt the heat of shame in my throat, but I smiled anyway. You learn to do that when your survival depends on it. I met Charles James when I was 22. He was quiet, serious, with large hands and a voice so deep it felt like a rumble beneath your feet. We met at church, exchanged letters, slow danced under the crepe myrtles on Saturday nights. He was a laborer, too, laying pipe for the county water department. We didn't have much, but we had each other. He proposed with a twist of wire fashioned into a ring, and I wore it with pride until we could afford better. We moved into a rented duplex on Rose Street and dreamed of someday owning a home. We both worked, me as a housekeeper, he in construction, and every spare dollar went into a little brown envelope hidden behind the sugar tin. We called it the Promise Fund. For years it grew slowly, coins and bills added with care and intention. Then came 1983. Charles caught pneumonia and died within a week. He was 36. The grief was the kind that robs you of air. I couldn't cry for weeks, couldn't eat, couldn't speak without feeling like my insides were unraveling. But life, cruel as it is, doesn't pause for your mourning. The landlord gave me 30 days to vacate. The county cut off his pension, and so I picked myself up and went back to work. The Promise Fund became my lifeline. I used it to pay first and last month's rent on a one-bedroom bungalow and continued saving. By the time I turned 40, I had enough for a down payment on a small white house on Jasper Avenue. This house. It was falling apart, no insulation, cracked foundation, but I saw something in it. Maybe it saw something in me, too. I signed the papers in a cheap office downtown and walked out holding the keys like they were holy. I spent every spare hour repairing what I could, asking for help when I couldn't. Mr. Simmons from church helped me fix the roof one spring. Miss Loretta's nephew replumbed the bathroom in exchange for a home-cooked meal every Friday for 3 months. Piece by piece, the house became more than a shelter. It became an extension of me. It was during these years, 50-hour work weeks, paint-stained hands, aching knees, that I first heard about the baby girl left at the county hospital. She was 2 months old. Her mother had vanished. Social services had no extended family, no options, and were considering placing her in foster care out of county. A friend of a friend told me. I wasn't even thinking of children at the time, but when I saw her, pale as milk, with wide gray eyes and a tuft of blonde fuzz on her head, something stirred in me. I adopted her and named her Haley. People stared. A black woman with a white baby was enough to stop traffic in 1989. I ignored them. Haley was mine, and that was all that mattered. I fed her from a bottle in the same kitchen where I now sip my morning tea. I rocked her to sleep on a squeaky chair by the fireplace. I taught her to walk on this porch, her tiny feet stumbling over planks I'd nailed down myself. The early years were hard, but beautiful. She called me Mama as soon as she could speak. She'd cling to my legs when I came home from work, bury her face in my apron, and demand stories about dragons and stars. I bought her books with the money I'd saved for curtains. Took her to the park in a borrowed car. I braided her hair, even when her classmates asked why it didn't match mine. It was during middle school that the distance began. Subtle at first, a rolled eye here, a sigh there. She stopped holding my hand in public. Asked why I couldn't talk proper like her friends' parents. She brought home friends who blinked at me like I was an exhibit in a museum. I smiled, as always, but inside, something small broke. By high school, she'd stopped introducing me as her mother. I became Margaret. Just Margaret. She moved through the world like someone trying to outpace her shadow. When she left for college, on scholarships and grants we filled out together, she didn't look back from the train window. I told myself that was normal. Children outgrow you. That's what love is, right? Letting go? Still, I saved every postcard she sent, reread every email. I followed her law school journey with pride and quiet awe. My daughter, mine, graduated with honors. Got a job at a firm in Atlanta. Married a man named Kenneth who called me ma'am and smelled like expensive cologne. They had a son. I met him twice, both times in a cafe off the interstate. Quick visits between client meetings. Now, in the present, I tend to my house and my memories. I water the begonias in the front yard, trim the rose bush that threatens to swallow the mailbox, and talk to the photograph of Charles above the mantel. I tell him about the birds nesting in the magnolia again, about the new neighbor who bakes 2 sweet pies, about the ache in my hip that won't let go. And sometimes I tell him about Haley, about how proud I am, about how far she's flown. But sometimes, on cold mornings when the sky is heavy and gray, I wonder if she remembers who raised her, if she knows what it cost me to give her the world, and if one day she'll come home not as a stranger in a rented car, but as the girl who once held my finger with her whole hand and believed I could slay dragons. I do not regret raising Haley, not once, but I wonder, quietly, if she regrets being raised by me. The kettle whistles. I pour the water into my chipped mug and take it to the porch. The wood beneath me groans in recognition. I sit, wrapped in the thin warmth of the rising sun, watching the light move across the grass like an old friend coming to visit. And I wait. For what, I'm not yet sure. But something is coming. I can feel it in the bones of this house, in the roots. It began with a knock at the door that wasn't expected. Not from the mailman or the neighbors who occasionally dropped off overripe tomatoes or banana bread wrapped in foil. No, this knock was brisk, deliberate, confident, like it belonged to someone used to being answered. When I opened the door, sunlight framed her like a magazine photo. Haley stood on my porch, dressed in a sleek beige coat, a black turtleneck beneath it, and leather boots that gleamed as though polished by someone else. Behind her, parked at an angle that nearly blocked my gravel drive, was a silver Range Rover with tinted windows. I didn't recognize the man who stepped out from the passenger seat until she turned slightly. "Hi, Mama," she said. Mama. The word had not graced her lips in years. Not since the postcards stopped, not since the holiday visits were replaced with text messages and promises of next time. Before I could reply, the child scrambled out from the back seat. Her son, 10 if I remembered right, clutched a tablet in one hand and a juice pouch in the other. He glanced up at me, expression neutral, before turning his attention back to the device. Then came the man, Kenneth. Tall, trim, with an expression carefully measured somewhere between disinterest and mild politeness. Haley leaned forward to hug me. A stiff press of shoulders, and I inhaled the scent of perfume I couldn't name. It clung to her like armor. "We were just passing through," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Passing through. That was how she framed every visit now, as if she were a tourist in a childhood she'd already forgotten. Inside, my living room felt suddenly smaller. Haley looked around with a tight smile, noting the crocheted pillows, the doilies on the armrests, the framed photos on the mantel. I saw the flicker of a frown behind her eyes, the judgment unspoken. Kenneth remained standing, his hands clasped in front of him while the boy dropped into my recliner like it was his own. "We thought we'd drop by and see how you're doing," she said, her voice full of brightness that didn't match her eyes. "It's been too long." Too long didn't begin to cover it, but I smiled anyway, motioned toward the kitchen. "Let me put on some tea." She followed, naturally, uninvited, trailing her presence behind her like a perfume cloud. Once inside the kitchen, she perched on the edge of a chair, crossed her legs, and smoothed invisible wrinkles from her pants. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," she said. I set the kettle on the stove and turned to her. "What's that?" She hesitated, then smiled, a politician's smile, one that had been practiced in a mirror. "Kenneth and I have been thinking about your future." I stood still, my hands on the counter. She continued. "You're not getting any younger, Mama, and this house, while it's lovely, is a bit, well, it's old, it creaks. The neighborhood isn't what it used to be. The grocery store closed. Your clinic is 2 towns over. We think it's time you considered downsizing." Downsizing, a polite word for displacement. "We found a beautiful place in Marietta," she went on. "It's a senior living community. Independent cottages, safe, new, close to medical care. It even has a pool and a little garden patch behind each unit. You'd love it." I let her speak, letting her words fill the room like rising water. "And," she added with a glance back toward the living room, "it would free up this house." Kenneth has contacts, developers who are very interested in this area. They'd pay good money for this property, enough to cover everything you need and then some. We could handle the sale, all the paperwork, everything. You wouldn't have to lift a finger. Now I saw it. The real reason. The garden patch was just a prop. What they wanted wasn't about safety or closeness or love. It was about opportunity. Money. She waited for my response. I took the kettle off the flame, set it on the counter without pouring, and looked her in the eye. "This house," I said slowly, "is not for sale." She blinked, the smile faltering just a touch. "Mama, I know this must feel sudden, but we've already been looking into the details. There's no pressure to decide right now, but we'd like to make things easier for you." Easier? The way you make it easier for someone to be pushed aside. That evening, after they left, Haley with another hug, Kenneth with a handshake as empty as a hollow tree, the boy without a word, I sat in my study and pulled open the drawer where I kept important papers. Property deed, tax receipts, letters from the mortgage company long since paid. I checked them twice. My name was the only one written there, but the unease didn't leave me. 2 days later, I received mail addressed not just to me but to Margaret James and family. Inside was a promotional packet from a real estate group in Atlanta. It included glossy photos of modern townhomes, floor plans, even a mock-up of what my land might look like if redeveloped for community enrichment. There was also a copy of a document I'd never seen before, a limited power of attorney form, supposedly giving Haley permission to act on my behalf. At the bottom, a signature that looked very much like mine, except I had never signed it. My hands began to shake, not from fear, from clarity. She hadn't come to visit me. She had come to take what I had built. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the sun dip behind the magnolia, its blossoms curled into themselves against the cool air. My tea had gone cold. The earth was quiet. But inside me, something had begun to stir. A knowing. An understanding that the daughter I had raised in love had returned not with warmth, but with entitlement. She believed she was helping. She believed she was saving me from myself. But I didn't need saving. I needed to defend what was mine. The next morning, I made phone calls to the church, to Miss Loretta, to Reverend Caldwell. I invited them to dinner. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Tompkins, who'd lived down the street since 1977, and asked if she could bring a pie. I asked Mr. Jenkins, whose son ran a small law firm, to join us too. Not a party, not a celebration, a gathering. I didn't tell them everything, but I would. And so I cooked. I ironed the linens. I swept the porch and polished the wood. I set the long table in the dining room, added 2 folding chairs to make space. Then I waited. Not in fear, in readiness. The house knew. Before the guests arrived, before the table was laid with china older than my daughter, before the first car rolled up the gravel drive, this house, with its bowed floorboards and slanted eaves, knew what was coming. It had survived decades of thunder and termites, years of silence and years of singing. Tonight would be a different storm. I moved slowly that morning, not out of weakness, but out of reverence. As I polished the silver serving spoons, I thought about the hands that had held them before. My own, my mother's, the ones I'd inherited but never seen. I pressed the creases into the white linen tablecloth, checked for chips in the plates, dusted the frames on the wall. The photo of Charles in his Sunday suit remained steady on the mantel. I met his gaze as I passed by, willing his calm into my bones. I didn't tell anyone exactly why I'd invited them. Not Haley, of course. She hadn't been invited. Not directly, but word travels faster than birdsong in our part of town. I made sure the right people knew, and I trusted the rest would follow. By late afternoon, the house had the hum of expectancy. Miss Loretta arrived first, wearing her green church dress and bringing a sweet potato pie that made the kitchen smell like Thanksgiving. Reverend Caldwell followed, with his quiet eyes and heavy Bible tucked under one arm. Mr. Jenkins came in a pressed shirt, his tie slightly askew, along with his boy Marcus, who had recently passed the bar and was eager to be of use. Neighbors trickled in, Mrs. Tompkins with her lemon pound cake, old Mr. Raymond in suspenders, even young Camilla from 2 houses down, who brought her toddler and a nervous smile. They all knew something was wrong. You could see it in the way they looked at me. Not curious, not nosy, but concerned, protective. Like they remembered how I once held this street together when times were lean. I served tea, I passed plates. I told stories that danced around the truth, not yet ready to land. We laughed politely, but the laughter had edges. Then a sleek black sedan pulled into the drive. Haley stepped out first, wearing high heels too thin for the gravel. Her coat flared at the waist, cinched tight with a belt that looked more expensive than anything in my wardrobe. Kenneth followed, checking his phone as always. Their son stayed in the car. I opened the door before they could knock. "Hello, Mama," Haley said, already performing. I stepped aside. The room quieted when she entered. Politeness filled the silence like steam, fogging every surface. Haley offered smiles that never reached her eyes, thanked people she didn't recognize, waved to the ones she did. Kenneth hovered at her shoulder like a silent echo. The dinner began without a speech. I let the clatter of forks and low murmur of conversation speak for a while. I refilled glasses. I made sure the cornbread was passed around twice. I listened. And then, as the plates cleared and dessert loomed near, I stood. "I'd like to say something," I said. Chairs shifted, heads turned. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I built this house," I said, "not with hammers or nails, but with work, with time, with sacrifice." The room held its breath. I came to this neighborhood when it was just cracked sidewalks and empty lots, when the only flowers were the ones I planted myself. I raised a child here. I buried a husband. I paid off every inch of this home with money earned, scrubbing floors and folding linens that didn't belong to me. Haley crossed her legs and smiled. The polite kind. The political kind. "I invited you here tonight," I continued, "because there's something happening that I can't allow to remain hidden. My daughter, my adopted daughter Haley, has attempted to take this house from me." Gasps were stifled. Forks froze in midair. Someone whispered, "Lord, have mercy." "She brought me a plan," I said. "A senior living community, they call it. A little cottage with a garden patch. Said I'd be safer. That I wouldn't have to worry about repairs or crime or distance from the hospital." I paused. "And, in the meantime, this land, this home, would be handed over to developers, her husband's people. A nice little package deal. All I had to do was sign away the deed." My voice did not shake. It rose, steady as a hymn. And when I refused, she submitted documents with my name forged. Now the silence was complete. "She tried to erase me," I said. "Not with violence, not with cruelty, but with a signature, with assumption, with the kind of entitlement that grows in the shadow of love unreturned." Haley stood up, Her face was pale now, the smile gone. "That's not true," she said. "Mama, I was trying to help." I turned to her. Help is a hand extended, not a pen forced into it. Reverend Caldwell closed his Bible slowly. Miss Loretta's lips pressed into a line. Kenneth remained still. I turned back to the room. This house is not for sale, and I am not in need of rescue. I've made a life here, a hard one, a beautiful one, and I will not be moved by guilt, by greed, or by anyone who mistakes my kindness for weakness. Then I sat, and the room stayed quiet. For a long time, no one moved. Then Miss Loretta began to clap. Just once, slow and deliberate, then again, and again. Soon the room joined her, not with applause, but with acknowledgement. Haley stood frozen. Her face had changed, not embarrassed, not angry, indignant. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, she reached for her glass of water. And then she threw it. The glass arced across the table in a blur of light and sound. It struck me on the cheekbone with a hollow crack. Water and glass exploded. The room erupted. I didn't fall. I didn't stagger. I reached up, touched my cheek, felt the sharp sting of blood. No one moved to her defense. Kenneth stepped back. Others stood. Some gasped. The boy in the car never came in. I stood again, and I walked out of the room. Not hurried, not afraid. I walked to my porch, sat in my chair, and watched the sky. My cheek throbbed, warm with blood and heat, but my heart was cool, because now there was no more pretending. My daughter had struck me, and I was done being silent. The bruise began to bloom before the blood had dried. I sat on the porch while the chaos behind me slowly collapsed into whispers, into movement, into something like shame. I heard the voices shifting from outrage to explanation, from concern to murmurs of discomfort. Someone brought me a wet cloth. Another offered to call the police. I waved them all off. I wanted no sirens. Not yet. Instead, I sat in the same chair where I'd once cradled Haley as an infant, her pale arms flailing in the summer heat, her cries softening in my arms. I had held her here after nightmares, after scraped knees, after the first time a schoolmate asked if I was the help. I had whispered stories into her ear on this very porch, stories of lions and queens, of courage and truth. She had clutched my hand then, believing I could fix the world. Tonight, she broke it instead. Inside, the sound of footsteps receded, doors closed, the murmurs dulled. By the time the last guest had gone, I was alone again. Just me, the magnolia tree, and the hum of cicadas too old to be bothered by human pettiness. When I finally rose, my hip ached, and the side of my face pulsed. The mirror in the hallway revealed a red welt already darkening into plum. A tiny cut beneath my eye had stopped bleeding, but it throbbed with every heartbeat. I didn't cry, not out of pride, out of clarity. I cleaned the wound, applied ointment, and wrapped an ice cube in a towel. I sat at the kitchen table, lit by the yellow overhead bulb that had buzzed for the last 3 years, and stared at the folded napkins still resting on the sideboard. Then I opened the drawer and pulled out the manila folder I'd been building for over a month. Receipts, photocopies, printouts of property records, bank statements, the fake power of attorney form Haley had submitted. I reviewed it all again. This time not as a mother, not even as a woman, but as a plaintiff. It was time to defend myself on paper. The next morning, I walked into the local police station. The young officer behind the desk didn't recognize me. I wore a wide-brimmed hat, not out of shame, but out of sun. He asked what I needed. "I'm here to file a report," I said. "Assault." His face changed when I lifted the brim and removed my sunglasses. The report took an hour. They took photos. They asked questions. They tried not to show surprise when I named my attacker. My daughter, I said. Adopted, but my daughter all the same. By the time I left, I held a case number in my hand and a strange feeling in my chest. Not triumph, not fear, relief. That evening, the calls began. At first, they were hesitant, curious. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years asking if I was all right, if I needed anything. Then came the others, angry, offended, indignant on Haley's behalf. She was just upset. It was a moment of passion. You're really going to press charges over a glass of water? No one asked how it felt to be struck, only how it looked to seek justice. One cousin even dared to say, "You should have handled it quietly. It's family." Family, that word again, the rope they wrap around your neck and call a necklace. The worst was the message from Kenneth. He called it an unfortunate misunderstanding, said that Haley was going through a difficult time and that a public escalation could hurt her reputation. He suggested we resolve this within the family and even offered a financial settlement to avoid further embarrassment. Embarrassment. He spoke as if I had caused it, as if I were the stain on their resume. I didn't reply. Instead, I called Marcus Jenkins, the young lawyer who'd attended the dinner. I asked for a consultation. We met at his father's hardware store behind a partition of curtain rods and paint cans. He took my statement, reviewed my documents, and said with steady eyes, "You have a case." When I left, I felt taller. For years, I'd been shrinking to fit the spaces others made for me. Quiet mother, grateful parent, aging black woman in a neighborhood she was lucky to live in, but no more. I was not lucky. I was earned. As word spread, the neighborhood responded the way neighborhoods do, some with silence, crossing the street when they saw me at the market, others with casseroles left at the door. Miss Loretta came by with a bouquet of zinnias and said only, "I was proud of you," before leaving. Haley did not call, but I knew she would, and she did. A week after the dinner, my phone rang just before midnight. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice trembled with indignation. She said the police visit had been unnecessary, that I had humiliated her in front of her child, that I had always made everything about me. She said, "I was trying to help you, Mama. I'm sorry, but I don't deserve this. I don't." That was the apology. A statement of innocence disguised as regret. The next day, I stood in the garden, hands in soil that remembered me. I pulled weeds with steady rhythm, feeling the old ache in my wrists return. My knees cracked when I bent. My back sang complaints. But my spirit was loudest of all, and it said, "Let her come. Let her bring lawyers and threats and crocodile tears. Let her hurl glasses and accusations. Let her call me selfish, stubborn, bitter, because I knew the truth. This house, this life, was mine, and I would not surrender it, not to her, not to anyone." The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, yellow, creased from the journey, stamped twice in red ink, confidential, legal notice. It was tucked in among the grocery store flyers in a church newsletter, a quiet threat hidden between routine and reverence. I brought it inside and opened it at the kitchen table with the same knife I used to cut string beans. The document inside was dense, printed in tight, sharp letters. Legal language. Cold words dressed in courtesy. A formal reply from Haley's attorneys, claiming the incident had been exaggerated, that the power of attorney was legitimate, that the injury was superficial and any damage to emotional peace was circumstantial. They requested the charges be dropped and insisted there was no basis for ongoing defamation. It wasn't a letter. It was a warning. And it arrived the same day I received a phone call from the local paper. "Miss James," the voice said, too cheerful for the time of day, We're doing a story about the changing face of property ownership in the city. We understand there's some dispute involving you and your daughter. We'd love your perspective." I declined, politely. But it was too late. The whispers had begun, not just among neighbors or church members, but online, where truth bent easily beneath the weight of perception. A blog appeared, then a repost. A thread on a local community forum titled "Daughter Disinherited for Trying to Help." The comments were swift and venomous. Some called me bitter. Others said I was abusing the system. One suggested that I never should have raised a white child if I couldn't handle being challenged. My hands trembled as I read, not with fear, but with fatigue. I had survived a world where people spat at my feet, where my husband was refused service on our honeymoon because of the color of his skin, where white mothers clutched their purses tighter when I passed with Haley in a stroller. I knew what violence looked like. This was its modern face. Digital, polished, legally sanctioned, and press-ready. The next day, I met with Marcus Jenkins again, this time in a proper office above the pharmacy. He wore a suit, and his voice was firm. "They're trying to intimidate you," he said. "It's textbook. The PR angle, the counter-accusations, the delay tactics. They want you to drop the case." "I won't," I replied. "You need to be ready for what comes next," he said. "They'll escalate. They'll dig." "Let them dig," I told him. "The dirt's not on me." Marcus smiled at that, and for a moment I saw the same fire in him I had once seen in Charles. Over the next week, the pressure thickened like humidity before a storm. A letter from the Homeowners Association arrived, citing concerns about the upkeep of my property, even though I trimmed my hedges weekly and repainted the fence last spring. A woman from the city showed up with a clipboard, claiming they'd had anonymous reports about improper garden drainage. A local pastor, not my own, called to say he'd heard about the lawsuit and asked if I'd consider mediation for the sake of peace. I asked him if he'd say the same to a woman whose daughter had struck her in public and filed forged documents to steal her home. He had no answer. Even Miss Loretta started looking at me sideways. "You sure you want to go through all this?" she asked one evening over cornbread and greens. "You're not young anymore, Margaret. Courts are slow and hearts are heavy. Maybe there's another way." "There is no other way," I said. "Not anymore." The real blow came when the church newsletter arrived the following Sunday. There, buried in a column about family unity, was a thinly veiled reference to me. An elder sowing discord against her own legacy. No names, of course, just enough innuendo to hurt. I didn't go to service that morning. I stayed home and pruned the rose bushes. One thorn sliced my thumb open, but I didn't flinch. Some wounds you carry, others you use. That evening, I pulled down a dusty box from the top of my closet. Inside were things I hadn't looked at in years. Letters from Charles, old photographs. One picture of Haley, age 5, and a Halloween costume I sewed myself. Pink wings, silver wand, a smile wide as summer. Beneath that, I found a folder of receipts. The deed to the house, the final mortgage payment, a copy of the adoption certificate, legal, stamped, permanent. I placed it all in a new folder, labeled it James v. James, and locked it in my cabinet. That same week, a city reporter came to my porch. "I'm not here to trap you," she said, "but people need to hear your side." I told her I'd think about it. 2 days later, I sat down with her. We met at the garden table in my backyard beneath the old magnolia. I told her everything. I didn't embellish, I didn't accuse, I simply told the truth. Her article ran online the following Sunday. She raised a daughter. Now she's fighting her in court. It included a photo of me beside the porch, the garden in bloom behind me. The comments this time were different. Supportive, sympathetic, furious. People recognized the pattern. Not just mine. Theirs too. Black women pushed aside, elders called burdens, generational wealth threatened not by strangers, but by their own. And so they wrote, "I see you. Stay strong. I'm next." The tide began to shift, slowly, but not before one more letter arrived. This one was unsigned. No return address. It simply read, "Old women like you don't know when to quit. Careful not to fall and break something you can't fix." I read it twice. Then I lit a match and burned it in the sink. 2 days later, I had a security camera installed above my porch. The man who set it up, maybe 20, shook my hand before leaving. "My grandma raised me," he said. "If anyone ever came for her house, they'd have to go through me." I nodded. I didn't cry, but something in me softened, like fresh soil after rain. And I knew the line had been drawn, not in sand, but in brick and foundation and blood. The mornings returned slowly, not as they had been before the wound, before the lawyers and the threats, but as something new, less quiet, less solitary. There was movement now in the air around my house, in the soil beneath my hands. Even the light filtering through the front windows felt changed, sharper, braver. I woke each day with a purpose. I cleaned the porch. I watered the tomatoes. I wrote in a notebook that had sat blank on my nightstand for years. I made lists. I took phone calls. I said yes to people I would have once politely dismissed. The neighborhood responded. One Saturday, as I planted zinnias in the front bed, a woman from 3 streets over stopped her car, rolled down the window, and said, "I read your story. You said what I've been wanting to say for 10 years. Then she drove away before I could reply. The next day, 2 women came by with gardening gloves and a flat of marigolds. They didn't ask. They just knelt beside me and started digging. By the end of the week, there were 7 of us. Not every day. Not on a schedule. But enough to feel like a pattern. Enough to feel like community. Miss Loretta returned too, quieter than usual, but with her arms full of starter herbs from the church greenhouse. "You're making something beautiful out of all this mess," she said, her voice rough. "I want to help." And so we did. We replanted, we swept, we repaired the back gate and painted the side fence a shade of pale blue that reminded me of Charles's Sunday tie. On Sundays, I started hosting small gatherings. Not church, not exactly social. Just time for women like me to sit, sip tea, and speak without interruption. We told stories that didn't always end in resolution. We laughed about things that once made us cry. We passed around photos and casseroles and memories that had never found a home before. They brought their daughters, their granddaughters, even a few curious sons. One young man, Marcus's cousin, asked if he could interview me for a college oral history project. I said yes, and when he came with a recorder and a stack of questions, I answered every one. But not everything was gentle. The lawsuit crawled forward. Court filings, depositions, delays. Haley's legal team sent letters filled with veiled threats and statements like, "Our client reserves the right to counterclaim for emotional distress." I sent them to Marcus without reading past the first paragraph. He remained steady. "We're winning," he told me one afternoon over lunch, "even if it doesn't feel like it." "Why doesn't it feel like it?" I asked. He smiled. "Because the people who win like you do, the long way, the hard way, they're too used to surviving to recognize triumph when it's finally theirs." Still, I stayed guarded. Haley hadn't called in weeks. Kenneth emailed Marcus once to propose a mediation meeting, but the terms were vague and insulting. Amicable discussion, mutual concession, private understanding. Marcus sent back 2 words: full accountability. The next day, I opened my mailbox and found a copy of an online article folded carefully, as if placed by hand. From Mother to Adversary, When Family and Property Collide. There was a photograph of me from the back, one I hadn't known was taken. The tone was neutral, almost clinical, but one quote caught my eye. "I'm not fighting my daughter," I had said. "I'm fighting for the right to not be erased by her." That line made its way across message boards, group chats, newsletters. I didn't mean for it to, but it struck a chord, especially with women who'd given everything and been left with silence. Then came the interview request. Not from a local reporter, not from the city, from a national publication. A woman named Cynthia called me from New York. "We're doing a piece on generational wealth and caregiving," she said, "and your story keeps surfacing in our research. Would you be willing to talk?" I told her I didn't think I had anything new to say. She said, "You already did. Now let more people hear it." We spoke for 2 hours over the phone. She was kind. Not soft, but kind. She asked questions no one else had. Not just about the lawsuit, or the slap of glass, or the property values. She asked about love. "What does it feel like," she said, "to raise a child with love and then face that child across a courtroom table?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "It feels like gardening in winter. You plant something, knowing you may never see it bloom." When the article came out, I was surprised by how many people wrote me letters. Real ones. Handwritten and careful script. From Georgia, from Maine, from Texas, from women I'd never met who told me about the sons who'd taken their names off bank accounts, the daughters who'd changed their numbers, the grandchildren who only showed up for holidays in cash. "I thought I was alone," one wrote. "Then I read about you." Another said, "You gave me permission to stop apologizing." Still, none of it compared to what happened next. Haley came to court, not with her lawyers, not with Kenneth. She came alone. It wasn't the trial yet, just a hearing. But she arrived in a gray dress with no makeup, her hair pulled back, her face tired. She sat across the aisle. We didn't speak. We didn't nod. But when the judge asked if the 2 parties had considered mediation again, she stood up before her lawyer could answer. "We'd like to schedule a meeting," she said. Her attorney looked stunned. So did Marcus. Afterward, she approached me in the hallway. "I'll bring terms," she said. "I understand now that this won't just go away." I looked at her. Really looked. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her voice cracked on the last word. She wasn't ready to apologize. But she was ready to stop pretending she didn't need to. That night, I sat on the porch alone and listened to the wind move through the leaves. I thought of how many women had sat just like this, watching the world shift around them, refusing to be moved unless it was by their own choice. The house creaked gently behind me, as if agreeing. Not yet healed, but no longer broken. The sky was pink the morning they came to sign the papers. Marcus arrived first, his briefcase clipped shut, a calm mask across his young face. He wore the same charcoal gray suit he always did for court, but had added a small red carnation in his lapel. "For luck," he said when I looked at it and smiled without needing a reply. The others followed soon after. The meeting was held in the community hall down the road, neutral territory, as they called it. The room smelled of old floor wax and lemon polish. Folding chairs lined the wall. A pitcher of water sat sweating on a metal cart beside a stack of disposable cups.